welcome everyone, particularly if this is your first ever SWP event. It's Marx, Nature and the Anthropocene. My name's Simon Doyle, I'm a member of the SWP in the student office and I'm your chair. Just to explain how the meeting will work, Camilla will speak for 25 minutes and then obviously open it up to the floor for contributions, questions, and definitely people should feel very welcome regardless of how familiar they are with the topic, and asking simple questions is encouraged as contributions. And the last thing to say before handing over is to introduce Camilla. Camilla's the deputy editor of the ISJ, with the International Socialist Journal. We've got a copy of that here with her, with a contribution on the Anthropocene. So with that, Camilla.
Thanks, Simon. So I thought I'd use the time to talk mostly about Marx and his method and his way of understanding capitalism, and about what other Marxists since Marx have said about ecology, and maybe touch on some of the debates between Marxists that we've seen in the last few years. So I won't say so much about climate change, people might want to discuss it in the discussion, but I think it's worth noting that climate change, nearly all scientists agree it's happening, but it's also happening at a faster rate than was predicted. Some very recent research looked at the ice sheets in the Antarctic, and looked at how much it's melting. It's melting underneath, which is going to contribute to rising sea levels as bits of it start to melt and go into the water. What this means in practice is that a warmer world means that we're likely to see more extreme weather. The 1st of June is usually considered the start of hurricane season in the Atlantic, so we're coming up to that now, and it looks like there'll be hurricanes again this summer, and that they could well be just as devastating as they were last year. And communities, particularly the poorest people in the Caribbean and in the south of the US, are still, of course, recovering from what happened last year. Some scientists have argued that the influence that human activity is having on the biosphere, on the Earth, is so profound and so global in scope that we're now living in the Anthropocene, which is basically defined as a geological epoch that's defined by human influence on Earth system processes. So if you accept the argument that we're in the Anthropocene, by the way, most geologists, they set up an Anthropocene working group, and I think all of them actually agreed that there is such a thing as the Anthropocene. They're mostly in agreement, actually, that it started in the middle of the 20th century. So very recent, actually, that we've switched from the Holocene, which is the epoch that we've been living in for the last 11,500 years, to Anthropocene, defined by human influence. So most of them agree on that. It means at some point that there's been a profound shift in the way that humans influence and relate to the biosphere. And that profound shift will be to do with how humans have organised themselves and what kind of society that we live in. So if you want to understand the Anthropocene, it's, I would argue, not just an issue for geologists and natural scientists to discuss. It's something that social scientists and historians are debating and discussing as well. Now, what happened to society that meant that humans have lived for tens of thousands of years? What's happened in the last 50 years or the last few hundred years that have caused that shift in the way that we relate to the environment, that means that we're now in the Anthropocene? Geologists say that they say that a future geologist, like a hypothetical future geologist, if they were looking at the ice cores and things, and if they were looking at what's in the layers of sediment that's been laid down in the late 20th century, they would find things like plastic being laid down in sediment. They found things like aluminium. We know that the oceans are full of plastic and other debris. They'd also find chicken bones, because there's 3 chickens for every person on the planet now. Their population has grown massively because of what humans have done in terms of domesticating chickens, but they're also different chickens to what you had 100 years ago. The bones would be much bigger because they have to cope with all that weight of the huge chicken that the bones are supporting, in order to produce enough meat. So even geologists have said that Will Stephan, who was part of the International Global Biosphere Programme, Geosphere Biosphere Programme, sorry. It said that the last 50 years have without doubt seen the most rapid transformation of the human relationship with the world in the history of the species. So what can Marx tell us about the Anthropocene and about the environment more generally? Of course, you know, we're talking about someone who was born 200 years ago and died in the late 19th century. He didn't understand the threat from climate change as we do now. He didn't understand, you know, he wouldn't have been familiar with commercially available plastics either. He wouldn't have predicted that the threat of plastic pollution. You know, some people say, oh, well, you know, he was a contemporary of John Tyndall. He went to his Royal Institution lectures, so you know, maybe he was there in the lecture where Tyndall, you know, put forward his theory of global warming and, you know, explained how global warming would work. But I don't think that we can really argue that Marx predicted what would happen with climate change. You know, he was a genius, but he wasn't, you know, omniscient. He didn't predict everything that would happen in the future. But so what can we learn from Marx to help us make sense of the world today? And I think there's two things really that we get from Marx. One is Marx's method, and the other is his more, what you might call his substantive conclusions, notably in his masterwork in Capital, where he develops his understanding of the capitalist system. So his method is materialist. It's a method that starts with real human beings and how human beings relate to the rest of nature, and how human beings are also natural beings, of course. It's historical and it's dialectical. It's historical because he understands that the way humans exist now and the way we relate to each other in the present isn't the way that humans have always related to each other, and you know, hopefully it won't be in the future. So he recognises that there are historical shifts in the way that society works, and sometimes quite abrupt shifts and revolutions. You know, this is quite important if you think back to the Anthropocene and the way we're trying to understand what has happened through history that has allowed humans to become that global force with that, you know, huge ability to modify the environment. His method is also dialectical because he understands the world as a totality. He understands different agencies at different elements of that totality that totality have, and you know, again, he understands the world as dynamic and fundamentally able to go through shifts and quick changes. Marx, in a quite enlightening paragraph in Capital, where he's starting to lay out where he's starting to talk about human labour. If people know it, it's the start of chapter 7 in Capital. It says that labour is, first of all, a process between man and nature, meant people and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. He sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, legs, head and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. Through this movement, he acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way he simultaneously changes his own nature. So there's a whole number of things packed into that quite short paragraph, I think. He's talking about metabolism, he's talking about the relationship between people and nature as being one that you might describe as metabolic, where we take materials from nature and also expel waste into nature, and there's this constant process of interaction with the rest of the natural world. He also talks about how humans have come to adapt the natural world, but he talks about how humans have changed as well, and so he's starting to get at human nature and how human nature can also change as we change the world around us. So you know, there's a lot packed into that paragraph, and I think it's really interesting that when Marx sets out to understand the labour process in Capital, he starts off with how do humans relate to nature. This is kind of the fundamentals of what you start with when you want to understand human labour and go on to understand what happens to human labour in a capitalist system. So to come on to what that capitalist system looks like, we know that capitalism is a dynamic system and that it's always changing and transforming itself, and it's changed a lot even through its short history. But I think you can boil capitalism down to a few essentials. It's essentially a system based on accumulation above all, accumulation for accumulation's sake and production for production's sake. You know, that's what drives capitalists, is their need to accumulate. Marx even makes a kind of a pun, and he says that accumulation is Moses and the prophets to capitalists. And there's two factors that allow for accumulation to occur. One is that workers are alienated, we're separated from the means of production, so we don't have control over our own labour. We talked in the first session about what that means for the working class. But there's also competition between capitalists. They're driven to accumulate because they're a band of warring brothers. The capitalists need to compete between each other in order to accumulate the most. I think that's kind of the essentials of what capitalism is, how I define it. But once you understand that kind of system, that capitalist system will treat nature in a very different way to other forms of society. In a feudal system, for example, I think Marx said something about the walls of the Lord's stomach being the sort of limit of how much he could accumulate. I guess it would generally been a man. They take from the serfs and exploit and oppress the serfs a lot in order to fulfil their own needs and to make themselves wealthy. But there's a limit to how much they can do that once they've got enough food, enough riches for themselves. That's kind of their limit. Whereas capitalists will accumulate and accumulate indefinitely. It's a fundamentally different type of system to feudalism, enabled by that historical shift of workers from a position where they controlled their own labour and ran their own kind of small farms and ran their own working lives to one where they're free but they go and work for a capitalist. So I wanted to talk mostly then, having kind of outlined in a kind of a very brief way of what Marxism means in terms of ecology and the environment, to go on to talk about what 20th century and 21st century Marxists have said about ecology. Because eco-socialism, I guess you'd call it, kind of arose in the context of the 1960s and the 1970s, and the emergence of environmentalism as a kind of social movement. And there were already people who worried about the environment. Marx and Engels were concerned about things like air pollution in their own day, but with the 60s you had the kind of emergence of an environmental social movement, I guess, defined by things like the Earth Day. The first one was in 1970. And things like that. It's part of the movements that sprang out of 1968 and out that era. Often very radical environmental movements. But these movements evolved a little bit autonomously from the sort of socialist left and the workers' movement. People might have seen, we did a conference a couple of years ago on Marx and Nature with International Socialism Journal. If you weren't there, the videos are all up online. But we had Ted Benton come and speak. He was one of the founders, really, of eco-socialism, but he talked about how, growing up, he was very, he was part of the workers' movement, and he was showing his solidarity to trade unionists in struggle. At the same time as that, he was also, due to his own kind of interests, he was interested in biodiversity and bees and wildlife and things, and he was, on the side going out and studying bees and stuff. But he never really saw a connection between the workers' struggle and the environmental struggle. And I think it was, understandable, actually, that it was understandable for environmentalists to be a bit sceptical of some forms of socialism in that era, because you had the Soviet Union, which was still proclaiming that it was socialist. Of course, we would not call it socialist. I think it fulfills the sort of definition of capitalism that I gave earlier. It's a form of state capitalism. But, nevertheless, they called themselves socialists, and you had things like the draining of the North Aral Sea, which was where the Soviet Union diverted rivers to irrigate cotton and other crops. And it was a huge environmental disaster. It drained this sea that was on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and it was just all the water was drained out, and there was a huge catastrophe for the fish that lived there, and a catastrophe for people that lived there as well. You had Chernobyl, of course, a couple of decades later. So, if environmentalists, were sceptical about socialism, you can see why. Socialists are also a bit sceptical about environmentalism as well at the time, because environmentalists could sometimes be a bit unsympathetic to workers' demands for jobs. There's a few sort of examples of that. There was kind of jobs versus environment debates. So early eco-socialism kind of What they argued essentially was that Marxism itself had to change in order to bring in ideas from the environmental movement and to build a kind of greener Marxism. So you had, as well as Benton, you had figures like James O'Connor, who really kind of tried to add to traditional Marxism, what he called traditional Marxism, by adding other bits to Marx's theories. So Alex said before that Marx understood capitalism as involving a contradiction between forces of production and relations of production. O'Connor kind of added onto this and said, well, there's a second contradiction because capitalism undermines its own conditions of existence by undermining the natural world, and that this might lead to crisis as well because it's because capitalism can't then, it doesn't value the raw materials and things, so that would lead to a huge expense for capitalists because they've degraded their own conditions of existence, and that would cost quite a lot for them to replace those conditions of existence. Essentially, the central point to take for this is that a lot of these figures they counterpose. 10 minutes left. They counterpose a traditional Marxism with a new ecological Marxism. But what I want to talk about next was that after that you had a kind of a second stage of eco-socialism, which was represented mostly by John Bellamy Foster and by Paul Burkett. John Bellamy Foster speaking at Marxism this year. He's come over from the US to speak. He's really a key figure because what he did was he said that, forget trying to combine Marxism with ecology. Let's go back to what Marx himself actually said and try and revive a kind of Marx's ecology. Like, what did Marx actually say in terms of his method and his understanding that is useful to ecology? His main contribution was that he drew on Marx's idea of metabolism that I mentioned earlier. And he said that humans maintain that constant relationship with the natural world, but once you have alienation from running their own labour process, once you have capitalism, then that creates a rift in the metabolism between humans and nature. Yeah, so at the same time as workers are alienated, that they're not able to run their own labour process, they're also not able to manage their relationship with nature in the same way that they had been before. They lose their ability to control that metabolism. This was a historical process that happened when workers were, happened in Britain when workers left the land and migrated into the cities at the same time as food and fibre and other goods were being shipped into the cities. Great loss of fertility for the soil in the countryside, and then at the same time in the cities you had waste, including human waste, just being dumped into the river and polluting it. There's no kind of there wasn't a rational way of running things by any means, and it was causing a huge crisis of soil fertility in Marx's day. So what Foster's work points to is that capitalism not only robs the worker but robs the soil at the same time. So there's processes that affect both workers and the rest of nature, and that sort of leading on from that, the idea that workers struggle against capitalism is also a struggle to run our relationship with nature in a more rational and sensible way. It's a common struggle against the capitalists. Foster's colleague, Paul Burkett, kind of continued in that tradition of saying, what is it about Marx's work itself that is useful for thinking about ecology? Burkett noted that Marx in Capital starts with the notion of a commodity, and as we might know, commodities embody different forms of value. They have a use value, exchange value, and value. A use value is anything that can be used by a human being to fulfil their needs or fulfill their wants or needs. An exchange value is simply how much a commodity exchanges for on the market. So, how many loaves of bread could I buy with a bottle of whiskey, or how many loaves of bread could I buy with a fiver, or and so on. But for Marx, that exchange value, the price on the market, is merely the outward appearance of another form of value, which is just called value. And that value is the abstract human labour embodied in the commodity. So it's human labour that, as we know from the first session, produces value and gives commodities their value. Of course, this causes a problem if it's only human labour that gives commodities value, and it has to be only human labour that gives them value, because otherwise everything that we talked about in terms of Marx's theory of exploitation and his theory of crisis and the tendency of profit rates to fall, all of that falls apart if you don't say that it's human labour that produces value. But then what about the labour of animals, for example? You might argue that maybe the work that a bee does when it produces honey should be considered a source of value. It's producing something. It's clearly a use value because it's useful to fulfil a human want. The bee expends energy when it does that. They're even called worker bees. But for Burkett, drawing on Marx, he said, actually no, the bees don't produce value when they produce honey, and this causes a problem for capitalism, because it can't then really, if it doesn't treat the work that bees do as producing value, it can't really value them in terms of monetary value. So there's a huge crisis at the moment, actually with bees, in that they're dying out, and they're sort of the stuff that they do can't be easily replaced by the capitalist. So a lot of people have objected to this and said, oh well, we should recognise the value of nature. But for Burkett, this is kind of Marx's point. Like, we do want to live in a society where the shade that's provided by a tree is valued, and the things that honeybees do to produce honey for us is valued. But unfortunately, that society is not capitalism. Capitalism only values things that are done by the human worker. So we need a completely different form of society which is a society based on use values and a society based on producing things that actually fulfill human needs. So people that say that, Marx is wrong because he only values human labour power, are kind of missing the point that it's capitalism that only values human labour power. It's not Marx. This is partly the reason why some people have been very critical of a thinker called Jason Moore, who wrote a book, Capitalism in the Web of Life. There's a review of it in one of the issues of the journal, if people might have read. But he tends to talk about... he says he agrees that only human labour produces value, but he tends, in reality, to talk about to slip into talking about value that's produced by aspects of non-human nature, and to see that as the key thing that we should look at, which isn't Marx's view, according to his critics. There's another element of the picture as well that I think we sometimes overlook, and that's the idea of the production of nature. And this is a theory that has developed quite distinctively from what Foster and Burkett and others have argued, which I probably don't have time to go into in huge detail, but this is most associated with Neil Smith, a Scottish geographer, sadly died a few years ago. It talks about production of nature, but it's not saying that we literally go out and build mountains by it's not saying that humans go out and and build everything that we see and everything that we think of as nature. But it is saying that nature is being irrevocably drawn into the production process. Everything out there has a potential to become a commodity in the capitalist system, as it's constantly kind of trying to expand itself and to try and commoditize everything. So, even though a tree that exists in the forest, even if we hadn't literally planted it, we still produce it in the sense that we draw it into the commodity circuits and turn it into a commodity. There's an excellent quote in his book, Uneven Development, where it says, in the form of a price tag, every use value is delivered an invitation to the labour process, and capital, by its nature the quintessential socialite, is driven to make good on every invitation. Smith also talked about subsumption as well, and this is an idea that actually comes from Marx, I think, where Marx makes a distinction between formal subsumption of labour and real subsumption of labour later on in Capital than the quote from chapter 7 that I referred to before. And the distinction is that once you have processes of real subsumption, when you're talking about labour power, that means that workers aren't just working for a capitalist, their actual nature of their labour is being transformed due to the capitalist's sort of desire to increase their relative surplus value, for all the reasons that I talked about at the start. Smith says that an analogous thing happens for nature. That nature is also being transformed as capitalists try to increase their the value that they can get by natural commodities. So if you look at things like GM crops, for example, you can see that we're not just taking bits of nature and uprooting the crops and selling them for a price, we're also transforming the nature of those crops, even to a molecular level. John Bellamy Foster's been quite critical of Smith, but I think we should. I think that John Bellamy Foster's work is absolutely crucial to developing that idea that Marx's own views were ecological, and his work's been hugely influential on a whole load of people and a whole load of really interesting work. But I think there are other theorists as well that we should also talk about and also have a role to play. I think that Neil Smith is one of them, and I think that his ideas about subsumption of nature are actually come from Marx. Foster says that Smith wants to subsume nature into society, like that he doesn't have any kind of interest in the reality of nature, or that he doesn't have any interest in carbon dioxide and what carbon dioxide is doing to the atmosphere, and that therefore Smith doesn't have any interest in the natural sciences, which I think misrepresents his view. I think it's true that his view is very, very human-centred. It is about ideas, and it is about how humans transform the world and about the role of ideas about nature in that transformation process. So it does start with what humans do. It doesn't start with the realities of sort of external, the nature that's external to humans. I mean, Smith also doesn't agree that there is any real nature outside of human influence. But I don't think that's the same as saying that Smith subsumes nature into society. I think that is misrepresenting or misunderstanding what Smith was arguing. And this is a debate that perhaps we can continue at Marxism when we have these discussions again. But so to end on, really, I think Marx didn't say that much explicitly about nature and ecology. We know from his notebooks now that he was actually reading a lot of natural sciences, and especially a lot of agricultural sciences of his time. So it's possible that if he'd lived a few decades more, he might have developed something more concrete about what capitalism is doing in terms of changing agriculture and the natural environment. So that's why kind of theorists since Marx have been trying to develop an ecological Marxism using the little bits that he did say, and trying to use his method to understand what capitalism's doing to nature. But I think even though there are all these debates between different theorists, I think what they agree on the whole is that the problem is capitalism. It's capitalism that means that in the last 50 years we've had this extraordinary influence on the earth and on the earth system processes. So we need to understand capitalism and the nature of it. That is why Marx is so essential for understanding ecology today. I don't think it's something that you can just add on to your ecological understanding. I think that Marx is the theorist of capitalism, and his work is absolutely essential.